You know what's crazy? The entire Roman Empire, this massive civilization that ruled for over 1,000 years, came crashing down because one guy made a single choice. Not a war, not a plague, not even an invasion, just one decision. And honestly, when you hear what it was, you're going to think I'm making this up. Alright, so we're going back to the year 285. The Roman Empire is still standing, but barely. It's like when you see a building that looks fine from the outside, but inside, everything's falling apart. The walls are cracking, the foundation is weak, and one strong wind could bring the whole thing down. That's Rome in the late 200s. They've got barbarians pushing at every border. The economy is a disaster. Inflation is so bad that money is basically worthless, and emperors are getting murdered left and right. Like, we're talking about 50 years where Rome had more than 50 different emperors. That's insane. Most of them didn't even last a year before someone stabbed them in the back or poisoned their wine. So into this mess walks a guy named Diocletian. He's not from some fancy Roman family. He's not a senator's son or a general's nephew. This guy worked his way up from absolutely nothing. His parents were probably slaves or freed slaves. We're not even sure. But Diocletian is smart, really smart, and he's tough. He joins the army, climbs the ranks, and eventually becomes emperor in 284. And when he takes power, he looks around at this empire that's about to collapse and thinks, I need to fix this. Now here's where it gets interesting. Diocletian actually does a pretty good job at first. He reforms the military. He fixes the currency. He reorganizes the provinces, and he even deals with some of the barbarian threats. The guy is basically holding the empire together with duct tape and determination. But then he realizes something. Rome is too big. Like way too big. You've got territories stretching from Britain all the way to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. It's millions of square miles, hundreds of different cultures, dozens of languages. And Diocletian is sitting in his palace thinking, there's no way one person can run all of this. It's impossible. The empire needs more than one emperor. So in 285, Diocletian makes his decision. He's going to split the empire. Not permanently. At least that's not what he thinks he's doing. He's just dividing it for administrative purposes. He names another general, a guy called Maximian, as his co-emperor. Diocletian takes the eastern half. Maximian takes the western half. They're supposed to work together, share power, keep the empire united. It's called the Tetrarchy, which means rule by four, because later they add 2 junior emperors under them as well. But that doesn't really matter for our story. What matters is that simple split, east and west, 2 halves of one empire. And you know what? It works. Kind of. For about 20 years, things actually get better. The empire stabilizes. The borders are more secure. The economy improves a bit. Diocletian is probably feeling pretty good about himself. He even does something no Roman emperor had ever done before. In 305, he voluntarily retires. Just steps down from power and goes to live in a palace he built on the coast, spending his days gardening and relaxing. And before he leaves, he probably thinks he's saved Rome. He's fixed the problems. The empire is going to last forever now. Except it doesn't. Because here's what Diocletian didn't realize. Once you split something, it's really hard to put it back together. Think about it like this. Imagine you have a piece of paper. It's whole, it's complete, it's one thing. Now tear it in half. Sure, you can tape it back together, but it's never quite the same, right? There's always that line where it was ripped. That division. That's what happened to Rome. After Diocletian retires, things fall apart fast. The whole tetrarchy system collapses within a few years. Different generals and politicians start fighting for power. And here's the thing. They're not fighting to become emperor of Rome anymore. They're fighting to become emperor of the East or emperor of the West. That division Diocletian created, it's not just administrative anymore. It's become real. It's become cultural, political, psychological. Eventually, a guy named Constantine wins the civil war and reunites the empire in 324. He's the one, by the way, who makes Christianity the official religion. But that's another story. Constantine tries to bring everything back together. But even he realizes the split is too deep. So you know what he does? He builds a whole new capital city in the east. Constantinople, named after himself, of course. It's in what's now Turkey, right on the border between Europe and Asia. Beautiful locations, super defensible, great for trade. And Constantine makes this new city the center of imperial power. Now think about what that means. Rome, the actual city of Rome, the place where it all started, where the Senate met, where Julius Caesar was assassinated, where Augustus built his golden age. that Rome is no longer the capital. The heart of the empire has moved east. The western half, the original Rome, it's becoming secondary, less important. The emperors don't even live there anymore. By the time Constantine dies in 337, the empire is technically united again, but really, it's split in every way that matters. The east is rich, powerful, well-defended. Constantinople is booming. Trade is flowing through it from all over the world. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa. The eastern provinces are densely populated, highly urbanized, economically productive. They've got Egypt, which is the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. They've got Syria and Anatolia with their wealthy cities. They've got Greece with its culture and history. The West, meanwhile, is struggling. The economy is weaker. The cities are smaller and less developed. The military is constantly fighting barbarian invasions along the Rhine and Danube rivers. And here's the problem. The West needs resources from the East to survive. But the East doesn't really need anything from the West. So over time, the two halves start to drift apart. They speak different languages. The East speaks Greek, the West speaks Latin. They have different priorities, different problems, different identities. In 395, when Emperor Theodosius dies, his two sons inherit the empire. One gets the East, one gets the West, and this time the split is permanent. Nobody even pretends they're going to reunify anymore. From this point on, you've got two separate empires. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Same name, same history, but completely different futures. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this is where things get really interesting. The Western Empire, the one that includes the actual city of Rome, starts falling apart almost immediately. The barbarians are pushing harder and harder at the borders. You've got Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, all these different tribes and peoples who want a piece of Roman territory. And the Western emperors just don't have the resources to stop them. In 410, something happens that shocks the entire ancient world. The Visigoths, led by a king named Alaric, sack the city of Rome. They break through the walls and spend 3 days looting the city. Now, Rome had been sacked before, way back by the Gauls in 390 BC, but that was 800 years ago. For most people living in 410, Rome hadn't fallen in living memory, or their parents' memory, or their grandparents' memory. Rome was eternal. Rome was invincible. Rome was forever. And then suddenly it wasn't. The sack of Rome in 410 is like a psychological earthquake. People across the empire are terrified. If Rome can fall, what's safe? What's permanent? Saint Augustine, one of the most important Christian theologians, writes an entire book called The City of God, trying to explain how this could happen and what it means. People are questioning everything. Their faith, their identity, their future. But here's the thing. The Western Empire keeps going for another 66 years after the sack of Rome. It's like a boxer who's been knocked down but keeps getting back up. Even though everyone knows he's going to lose, more barbarian invasions, more territory lost. The emperors become weaker and weaker, more and more powerless. They're basically puppets controlled by barbarian generals who hold the real power. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire is doing fine. Sure, they've got their own problems. They fight wars with Persia. They deal with religious controversies. They have their own political drama. But Constantinople is still standing strong. The economy is still working. The military is still effective. The East is surviving because it has resources, wealth, and most importantly, defensible borders. In 476, the final Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, gets deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer, and that's it. That's the end. Odoacer doesn't even bother declaring himself emperor. He just sends the imperial regalia, the crown and the purple robes and all that ceremonial stuff, to Constantinople and says, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore." The Western Roman Empire is done, finished, over. But the Eastern Roman Empire keeps going. For another 1,000 years, 1,000 years. They don't call themselves the Byzantine Empire, by the way. That's a name historians made up later. They call themselves Romans. They see themselves as the continuation of Rome, the real Rome, the Rome that survived. And in a way, they're right. Constantinople stands until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks finally conquer it. That's nearly a millennium after the West fell. So let's go back to that decision Diocletian made in 285, splitting the empire. He thought he was solving a problem. The empire was too big, too complex, too hard to manage. By dividing it into two administrative zones with two emperors, he believed he was making it stronger, more efficient, more capable of dealing with threats. And maybe in the short term, he was right. The empire did stabilize under the tetrarchy. Things did get better for a while. But in the long term, that split created a division that could never be healed. It set up a dynamic where the East and West had different interests, different strengths, different trajectories. It moved the center of power away from Rome itself, weakening the symbolic and political importance of the city that gave the empire its name. It created two separate governments, two separate armies, two separate economies that competed as much as they cooperated. When the barbarian invasions came, and they were always going to come, the West couldn't handle them alone. And the East did the math. Why send resources and troops to defend the West when those resources and troops were needed to defend the East? Why risk Constantinople to save Rome? It made sense from their perspective. They were looking out for their own survival. And that's the thing about Diocletian's decision. It made sense. It was logical. It was practical. If you were sitting in his position in 285, looking at this massive, crumbling empire, you'd probably make the same choice. Something had to change. The status quo wasn't working. But sometimes, the logical solution creates problems you never anticipated. Think about it this way. Rome had survived so much. Invasions by Hannibal, civil wars between Caesar and Pompey, the chaos after Caesar's assassination, the year of the four emperors, the crisis of the 3rd century. Time and time again, Rome had faced existential threats and survived. Why? Because it was unified, because there was one empire, one identity, one purpose. When Rome was threatened, all of Rome responded. But after the split, that unity was gone. When the West was threatened, the East shrugged. When Rome itself was sacked in 410, Constantinople mourned, but didn't send help. The two halves of the empire had become two different worlds. And the West, the poorer, weaker, more vulnerable half, couldn't survive on its own. Now, I'm not saying the fall of the Western Roman Empire was inevitable. History doesn't work like that. There were lots of factors. Economic decline, military problems, barbarian pressure, political instability, disease, climate change, corruption. All of these things played a role. But the division of the empire was the crack in the foundation. It was the underlying weakness that made everything else worse. If Rome had stayed unified, would it have survived? Maybe, maybe not, but at least it would have had a chance. The resources of the East could have been used to defend the West. The wealth of Egypt and Syria could have paid for armies to fight the Goths and Vandals. The walls of Constantinople and the walls of Rome could have been defended by the same empire, the same people, the same sense of shared destiny. Instead, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, the people in Constantinople probably thought, well, that's too bad, but at least we're safe. And they were safe for another 1,000 years. But that wasn't the Roman Empire anymore, not really. It was the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Something new, something different, something that grew out of Rome, but wasn't Rome. The real Rome, the Rome of Augustus and Caesar and Cicero, the Rome of the legions and the Senate and the Colosseum, that Rome fell in 476. And it fell, ultimately, because 191 years earlier, an emperor named Diocletian made a decision that seemed smart at the time. Split the empire. Divide the administration. Make it easier to govern. Save Rome by cutting it in half. Except you can't save something by dividing it. Not permanently. Not when the threats you face require unity, cooperation, shared sacrifice. Diocletian saved the empire in the short term, but his solution contained the seeds of its destruction. By creating two empires where there had been one, he ensured that eventually at least one of them would fall. And here's what really gets me about this whole story. Diocletian died in 311, probably around age 65. He lived long enough to see his tetrarchy collapse into civil war. He lived long enough to see Constantine reunite the empire and build Constantinople. He lived long enough to realize that his solution hadn't worked the way he planned. There's this famous story, probably not true but too good not to mention, that some of his old colleagues asked him to come out of retirement and take power again during the civil wars. And he supposedly said, "If you could see the cabbages I've grown in my garden, you wouldn't ask me to do this." He was done. Retired, finished with politics. But I wonder if he ever thought about that decision he made in 285, if he ever lay awake at night in his palace, looking out at the sea, thinking about how his attempt to save Rome might have doomed it instead. Probably not. People rarely see the long-term consequences of their choices, especially leaders who are too focused on immediate problems to worry about what might happen decades or centuries later. That's the tragedy of it, really. Diocletian was trying to do the right thing. He saw a problem and he came up with a solution. He wasn't trying to destroy the empire. He loved Rome. He spent his entire life serving it. But the road to destruction is paved with practical solutions to immediate problems. Sometimes the thing that saves you today kills you tomorrow. Let me give you another angle on this. The split didn't just divide resources and military power, it divided culture and identity. Language is a huge part of this. In the West, people spoke Latin. In the East, people spoke Greek. Now sure, educated people in both halves spoke both languages, but the average person? They spoke one or the other. And language shapes how you think, how you see the world, how you define yourself. As the centuries went on, the East became more and more Greek in character. They started to see themselves less as Romans and more as Greeks, or at least as heirs to both Roman and Greek civilization. The West stayed Latin, but it also started to fracture into regional identities. You had Gauls in France, Hispani in Spain, Italians in Italy. The unity that came from being Roman started to fade. Religion played a role too. Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire in the 4th century, but Christianity itself split between East and West. The Eastern Church and the Western Church had different practices, different hierarchies, different theological ideas. By the time the Western Empire fell, the two churches were already drifting apart. Eventually, in 1054, they formally split in what's called the Great Schism. East and West, divided in faith as well as politics. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're not just talking about military defeat or economic collapse. We're talking about the dissolution of a unified civilization into separate pieces. And that dissolution started with Diocletian's decision to split the empire. Everything else flowed from that. Now, some historians argue that the split was inevitable. They say the empire was already too big, too diverse, too complex to hold together. They say Diocletian was just recognizing reality, not creating it. And maybe they're right. Maybe Rome was always going to split eventually. But there's a difference between something happening naturally over time and someone actively making it happen. Diocletian didn't just acknowledge the empire's problems. He institutionalized the solution. He made the split official, legal, permanent. Before Diocletian, when there were multiple emperors, it was usually because of civil war or temporary arrangements. After Diocletian, it became normal. Expected, the way things were supposed to be. And once something becomes normal, it's really hard to change it back. Let's talk about some of the specific ways the split hurt the West. First, money. The eastern provinces were way richer than the western provinces. Egypt alone produced enormous amounts of grain that fed the entire empire. Syria and Asia Minor had wealthy cities engaged in trade with the rest of the known world. The East controlled the trade routes to India and China. Meanwhile, the West had some agriculture, some mining, but nothing compared to the economic engine of the East. When the empire was unified, that wealth was shared. Taxes from Egypt paid for soldiers defending the Rhine frontier. Trade revenue from Antioch funded roads in Gaul. But after the split, the East kept its wealth and the West had to make do with less. The Western emperors couldn't afford to pay their armies properly. Soldiers started demanding land instead of money, which turned them into farmer soldiers who were less professional and less effective. The decline in military quality made the West more vulnerable to barbarian invasions, which made the economic situation worse, which made the military situation worse. It was a downward spiral. Second, manpower. The East had more people, especially more urban, educated, skilled people. When you needed to recruit soldiers, administrators, engineers, or craftsmen, the East had a bigger pool to draw from. The West was more rural, more agricultural, less densely populated. This meant that when the West faced multiple simultaneous threats, which happened a lot in the 5th century, they just didn't have enough people to deal with all of them. Third, geography. The East had better natural defenses. Constantinople itself was almost impossible to attack. It was surrounded by water on 3 sides and had massive walls on the land side. The eastern provinces were protected by mountains and deserts that made large-scale invasions difficult. The west, on the other hand, had long, vulnerable land borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Barbarian tribes could cross those rivers relatively easily, especially in winter when they froze. The west was constantly playing defense, constantly reacting to invasions, never able to get ahead of the problem. Fourth, barbarian settlements. This is a big one. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western emperors started allowing barbarian tribes to settle inside the empire's borders. These tribes would supposedly defend the frontiers in exchange for land and supplies. It seemed like a good solution to the manpower problem. The empire got soldiers without having to recruit and train them, and the barbarians got a place to live. But over time, these barbarian settlements became barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths settled in Spain and southern Gaul. The Vandals took North Africa. The Burgundians took eastern Gaul. The Franks took northern Gaul. The Ostrogoths eventually took Italy itself. These groups nominally recognized the Western emperor's authority, but in practice, they ruled independently. The Western Empire became a patchwork of semi-independent barbarian kingdoms with a powerless emperor in the middle. And here's the thing. The East didn't have to do this. Sure, they dealt with barbarian threats too, but they had the resources to buy them off or the military strength to defeat them. They didn't have to let barbarian tribes settle inside their borders and slowly take over. The West did it because they were desperate, because they were weak, because they'd been divided from the rich, powerful East. By the time Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, the Western Empire barely existed anymore anyway. The emperor controlled Italy and not much else. All the other western provinces had been taken over by barbarian kingdoms. So when Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, he was really just making official what had already happened. The West was gone. But here's something interesting. Those barbarian kingdoms that took over the West, they didn't think of themselves as destroying Rome. They wanted to be Roman. They adopted Roman titles, Roman laws, Roman customs. The Frankish kings called themselves Roman consuls. The Ostrogothic king in Italy, Theodoric, ruled in the name of the Eastern Emperor and tried to preserve Roman culture. These barbarians, they've been living next to Rome for so long, they've been trading with Rome, fighting for Rome, learning from Rome, that they wanted to be part of it. So in a weird way, Roman culture survived the fall of Rome. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire kept using Latin, kept following Roman law, kept maintaining Roman buildings and roads. The Catholic Church, which was based in Rome and led by the Pope, continued to spread Roman Christian culture across Europe. The idea of Rome, the dream of Rome, lived on long after the actual empire fell. But that's not the same as the empire surviving. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476. That's a fact. And it fell because it was divided from the East. Because it didn't have the resources to defend itself. Because Diocletian's decision in 285 created two empires where there had been one. Now let's talk about the Eastern Empire again, because their story is fascinating. After the West fell, the East just kept going. The emperors in Constantinople still called themselves Roman emperors. They still dreamed of reconquering the West and restoring the old empire. And in the 6th century, they actually tried to do it. Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, launched a series of wars to retake the western provinces. He reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. He reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths. He even took part of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, it looked like the Roman Empire might actually be reunited. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake again, just like in the old days, but it didn't last. Justinian's wars were incredibly expensive. They drained the eastern treasury. They stretched the eastern army thin. And they didn't really solve the underlying problem, which was that the West was poor and hard to defend. After Justinian died, most of the reconquered territories were lost again. Italy was invaded by the Lombards. North Africa eventually fell to the Arabs. Spain stayed under Visigothic control. The effort to reunite the empire failed, and it failed for the same reasons the Western Empire fell in the first place. The West wasn't economically viable on its own, and the East couldn't afford to support it indefinitely. Diocletian's split had become permanent, not because of administrative convenience, but because the two halves of the empire had become fundamentally different places with different capabilities and different destinies. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, survived until 1453. They faced invasions from Persians, Arabs, Turks, Crusaders, and eventually Ottoman Turks. They lost territory bit by bit over the centuries. But Constantinople itself, that great city Constantine built, stood for more than 1,000 years after the West fell. It was one of the greatest cities in the world, a center of art, culture, learning, and power. But it wasn't Rome, it was something that grew out of Rome. Something that carried Rome's legacy, but it wasn't the same. The Rome of Augustus, the Rome of the legions and the Senate and the Colosseum. That Rome died in 476, and it died because an emperor in 285 made a decision that seemed smart at the time but had consequences he never imagined. So what's the lesson here? Is it that we shouldn't try to solve problems? No, of course not. Is it that all solutions create new problems? Maybe, but that's kind of obvious. I think the real lesson is about unity. About how hard it is to hold things together and how easy it is to let them fall apart. About how a civilization, a country, an empire, any kind of human organization, it's always under pressure to fracture, to divide, to split into smaller pieces. And once that process starts, it's really hard to stop. Diocletian thought he could split the empire temporarily, just for administrative purposes, and then it would come back together. But that's not how it works. Once you divide people, once you give them separate institutions, separate identities, separate interests, they stay divided. The split becomes real. It becomes cultural and psychological, not just political. And then when a crisis comes, and a crisis always comes, the divided pieces can't work together to survive. Rome survived for 1,000 years because it was unified. Because people from Spain to Syria all thought of themselves as Romans. Because the resources of the entire empire could be mobilized to face any threat. But after Diocletian split the empire, that unity was gone. And without unity, the West couldn't survive. It's kind of like a relationship, actually. You can have two people who love each other, who are committed to each other, but if they start living separate lives, having separate friends, pursuing separate interests, eventually they drift apart. And when a crisis comes, when they really need each other, they don't have that foundation of unity anymore. They can't work together. They can't save the relationship. It falls apart. That's what happened to Rome. Diocletian divided the empire, and over time, East and West drifted apart. They started speaking different languages, worshiping in different ways, facing different problems, pursuing different goals. And when the West faced its crisis in the 5th century, the East wasn't there to help. Not because they were evil or uncaring, but because they didn't see it as their crisis anymore. The unity was gone. And that's the real tragedy of the fall of Rome. It didn't have to happen. If the empire had stayed unified, if the resources of the East had been available to defend the West, if there had been one Roman identity instead of two, maybe, just maybe, Rome could have survived. Maybe it could have adapted to the changing world, integrated the barbarians, evolved into something new while keeping its core intact. But we'll never know because Diocletian made his decision in 285. He split the empire. He thought he was saving Rome. And for a while maybe he did, but in the long run, he doomed it. One decision, one moment. One choice that seemed logical and necessary at the time, but changed the course of history. That's what gets me about history. It's not usually the big, obvious moments that matter most. It's the quiet decisions, the practical solutions, the things that seem reasonable at the time but have consequences that echo for centuries. Diocletian probably didn't think he was ending Rome when he split the empire. He probably thought he was being smart, pragmatic, realistic. And by the standards of his time, he was right. But history doesn't judge you by the standards of your time. History judges you by what actually happened. And what actually happened was that Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, less than 200 years after Diocletian's decision. And while there were many factors, many causes, many reasons, that split was the foundation. That was the crack that everything else exploited. So yeah, one decision ended the Roman Empire. Not immediately, not obviously, but inexorably, inevitably, tragically. Diocletian split Rome to save it, and in doing so, he destroyed it. And 1,000 years of history came to an end because one man made one choice that seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, there's this moment I keep thinking about. It's 305, and Diocletian is standing in front of the army and the Senate, and he's announcing his retirement. This is unprecedented. Roman emperors don't retire. They die in office, usually violently. But Diocletian is tired. He's been ruling for 21 years. He's dealt with rebellions, invasions, economic crises, religious controversies. He's reformed the entire government. He's split the empire, and now he just wants to go home and rest. And as he's giving his speech, he probably looks out at all these people and feels proud. He saved Rome. He stabilized the empire. He created a system that will keep working after he's gone. He's done what he set out to do, and then he leaves. He goes to his palace in Split, in modern-day Croatia. And he spends the last 6 years of his life gardening and relaxing and staying out of politics. But here's what he doesn't know. He can't know. He doesn't have a time machine. He doesn't know that in 171 years, Rome will be sacked by the Visigoths. He doesn't know that in 191 years, the last Western emperor will be deposed. He doesn't know that his solution, his brilliant administrative reform, will be the beginning of the end. And honestly, maybe it's better that he doesn't know. Maybe it's better that he dies thinking he saved Rome, because the truth would break him. The truth is that his decision, made with the best intentions, with genuine love for the empire, with real practical wisdom, that decision was the first step toward Rome's destruction. Let me tell you about what happens in those years between Diocletian's retirement and the fall of Rome, because it's not a straight line. It's not like he splits the empire and boom, Rome falls. It's a slow process, a gradual decline, with moments of recovery and moments of collapse, with heroes and villains and a lot of ordinary people just trying to survive. First, the Tetrarchy collapses. Diocletian had set up this system where there were 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, and they were supposed to smoothly pass power from one generation to the next. But as soon as Diocletian retires, everyone starts fighting. There are civil wars all over the empire. Different generals and politicians backing different candidates. The East fighting the West, the army fighting the Senate. It's chaos. Constantine emerges from this chaos as the winner. He defeats his rivals one by one, and by 324, he's the sole emperor of a reunited empire. And Constantine is actually a pretty good emperor. He's a strong military leader. He's a smart politician. He converts to Christianity, which changes the entire religious landscape of the empire. And he builds Constantinople, this magnificent new capital that will outlast Rome itself. But even Constantine realizes the empire is too big for one person to manage effectively. So he doesn't reverse Diocletian's split. He keeps the administrative division between East and West. He just rules both halves himself. And when he dies in 337, he divides the empire among his sons. The unity he created dies with him. For the next 60 years, the empire goes back and forth between unity and division. Sometimes one emperor rules everything. Sometimes 2 or 3 emperors share power. Sometimes they cooperate. Sometimes they fight. It's unstable, chaotic, constantly changing. But through all of this, the fundamental division Diocletian created remains. East and West, 2 halves of one empire, getting further apart with every passing year. In 378, something happens that shows just how far apart East and West have drifted. There's a huge battle at Adrianople, in the eastern part of the empire where a Roman army fights the Visigoths. The eastern emperor, Valens, leads his army personally. And he doesn't wait for reinforcements from the west. He doesn't coordinate with the western emperor. He just charges into battle because he wants the glory for himself, because he doesn't trust his western colleague. Because East and West are rivals as much as they are partners. The Romans lose. Badly. Valens is killed. 2/3 of the eastern army is destroyed. It's one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. And you know what the West does? Nothing. They send some condolences. They express their sympathies. But they don't send armies. They don't send resources. They leave the East to deal with the problem on their own. Now, to be fair, the West has its own problems. They're dealing with invasions across the Rhine. They're fighting rebellions in Britain. They're struggling with their own barbarian threats. But that's exactly the point. If the empire was truly unified, those wouldn't be separate problems. They'd be Roman problems. The full resources of Rome would be mobilized to deal with each threat. But because of the split, East and West are separate. They have separate problems, separate priorities, separate armies. They're 2 empires in everything, but name. In 395, Emperor Theodosius dies. He's the last emperor to rule both East and West. And when he dies, he officially splits the empire between his 2 sons. Arcadius gets the East, Honorius gets the West. And this time there's no plan to reunite them. This is permanent, From this moment on, there are two Roman empires: the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Same history, same name, but completely different futures. Arcadius, ruling from Constantinople, inherits a relatively stable, wealthy, powerful state. Sure, there are problems. There are always problems. But the Eastern economy is strong. The Eastern army is recovering from Adrianople. The Eastern provinces are secure. Arcadius doesn't have to be a great emperor. He just has to not screw things up too badly. And he doesn't. The East survives, thrives even. Honorius, ruling from Ravenna because Rome itself is too hard to defend, inherits a nightmare. The Western economy is weak. The Western army is full of barbarian mercenaries who are only loyal as long as you can pay them. The frontiers are under constant pressure. And Honorius himself is young and experienced and not very bright. He's got advisors and generals who actually run things, but still, the West is in trouble from day one. And the trouble just keeps getting worse. In 406, a huge wave of barbarian tribes crosses the frozen Rhine River into Gaul. Vandals, Alans, Suevi, all these different groups, fleeing from the Huns who are pushing west from Central Asia. They rampage through Gaul and Spain, destroying cities, disrupting trade, killing and enslaving people. The Western government tries to stop them, but doesn't have the military strength. The Western provinces start to slip out of Roman control. In 410, as we talked about earlier, the Visigoths sack Rome. This is a psychological shock to the entire world. Rome hasn't fallen in 800 years. Rome is supposed to be eternal. And now barbarians are looting the city, stealing treasures, burning buildings. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem when he hears the news, writes that he can't even speak. He's so shocked. The whole world is dying with Rome, he says. But you know what's interesting? The sack of Rome in 410 isn't really that significant militarily. The Visigoths only stay in the city for 3 days. They don't destroy it completely. Most of the population survives. The city recovers, more or less. But the psychological impact is enormous. If Rome can fall, nothing is safe. Nothing is permanent. The old certainties are gone. And the Western Empire keeps stumbling along. In 429, the Vandals cross from Spain into North Africa. This is a disaster for the West because North Africa, especially the province around Carthage, is incredibly important. It produces grain that feeds Italy. It generates tax revenue. It's one of the richest parts of the Western Empire, and the Vandals take it. They establish their own kingdom centered on Carthage. They build a navy and start raiding the Mediterranean coast. And the Western government can't stop them. In 451, Attila the Hun invades Gaul with a massive army. This is actually one of the few moments where East and West kind of work together. The Western general Aetius, who's actually the real power in the West at this point, forms an alliance with the Visigoths and other barbarian tribes to fight Attila. They meet at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, somewhere in central Gaul, and they stop Attila's advance. It's considered one of the decisive battles in history because if Attila had won, he might have conquered all of Western Europe. But here's the thing, the army that stops Attila isn't really a Roman army. It's a coalition of Romans and barbarians. And honestly, there are more barbarians than Romans. The Visigoths do most of the fighting. The Roman contribution is leadership and coordination. The Western Roman Empire at this point is basically just a framework that holds together a bunch of barbarian kingdoms. It's not really an empire anymore. After Aetius dies in 454, murdered by Emperor Valentinian in a fit of jealousy and paranoia, there's nobody left who can hold things together. The West goes through a series of weak emperors who are controlled by barbarian generals. These emperors have no real power. They're just figureheads. The barbarian generals are the ones who actually run things, and they're only interested in protecting their own power and wealth. By the 460s and 470s, the Western Empire is barely functioning. The emperor controls Italy and not much else. All the other Western provinces have been taken over by barbarian kingdoms. Britain is independent, ruled by local warlords. Gaul is divided between the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and the Franks. Spain is controlled by the Visigoths. North Africa belongs to the Vandals. Even parts of Italy are under barbarian control. And then in 476, a barbarian general named Odoacer, who commands what's left of the Western army, decides he's had enough. The current emperor is a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. His name is kind of ironic. Romulus after the founder of Rome. Augustus after the first emperor. But he's powerless, a puppet. Odoacer deposes him, sends him into retirement with a pension, and doesn't bother naming a replacement. Instead, Odoacer sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The crown, the purple robes, the scepter, all the ceremonial stuff that symbolizes imperial power. He sends a message saying, "We don't need a separate emperor in the West anymore. The Eastern emperor can be emperor of the whole empire. I'll just run Italy as his representative." And the Eastern emperor, Zeno, says, "Okay, fine, whatever." He's got his own problems to deal with, and that's it. That's the end of the Western Roman Empire. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. No great final battle. No heroic last stand. Just a general deposing a teenager and sending the imperial regalia east. After that, there's no Western emperor. No Western empire. Just barbarian kingdoms scattered across what used to be Roman territory. Now you might be thinking, wait, if the Eastern emperor is still around, isn't the Roman Empire still around? And technically, yes. The Eastern Roman Empire continues until 1453, but it's not the same. The empire has lost half its territory, half its population, half its resources. More importantly, it's lost Rome itself. The city where it all started. The symbolic heart of the empire. The place that gave the empire its name and identity. The Eastern Empire survives, and it's actually pretty successful for a while. Under Justinian in the 6th century, as I mentioned earlier, they reconquer a lot of the lost Western territories. They have a cultural renaissance. Constantinople becomes one of the great cities of the medieval world. But they increasingly speak Greek instead of Latin. They develop their own distinct culture and identity. They become the Byzantine Empire, even though they still call themselves Roman. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really talking about the fall of the West. The original Rome. The Latin-speaking, Western half of the empire that included the city of Rome itself. And that fell in 476, exactly 191 years after Diocletian split the empire. Now let's think about what this means. Let's think about how one decision made with good intentions by a smart, capable emperor led to the collapse of one of the greatest civilizations in history. Because this isn't just ancient history. This is a lesson about human nature, about politics, about how societies rise and fall. Diocletian faced a real problem. The empire was too big, too complex, too difficult to manage. Communication was slow. It took months for messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Armies had to be positioned at multiple frontiers simultaneously. Different regions had different needs, different problems, different cultures. One person couldn't possibly manage all of it effectively. So Diocletian's solution made sense. Divide the empire into 2 administrative zones. Put an emperor in charge of each zone. Let them focus on their specific problems. Coordinate when necessary, but give each half the flexibility to respond quickly to local threats. It's logical, it's practical. It's the kind of thing a modern management consultant might recommend. But what Diocletian couldn't account for was human nature. Once you divide people into groups, those groups develop their own identities, their own interests, their own loyalties. What starts as an administrative convenience becomes a real division. The people in the East start thinking of themselves as Easterners. The people in the West start thinking of themselves as Westerners. And slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, they stop thinking of themselves as Romans first. This happens in all kinds of contexts, not just ancient empires. You see it in companies that split into different divisions. The divisions start competing with each other instead of cooperating. You see it in countries with federal systems, where states or provinces develop strong regional identities that sometimes conflict with national identity. You see it in families when siblings inherit a family business and divide it up. The business fragments and the family relationships suffer. The principle is always the same. Unity is hard to maintain. Division is easy to create but hard to reverse. Once you split something, it wants to stay split. The forces pushing things apart are always stronger than the forces holding things together. And this is especially true in times of crisis. When everything is going well, unity is easy. When resources are abundant, everyone cooperates. When there are no external threats, internal divisions don't matter much. But when crisis comes, when resources are scarce, when there are real threats that require real sacrifices, that's when divisions become fatal. The Western Roman Empire fell because it couldn't handle the barbarian invasions of the 5th century. But it couldn't handle those invasions because it didn't have the resources it needed. And it didn't have the resources it needed because it had been separated from the wealthy, powerful East. And it had been separated from the East because, nearly 200 years earlier, Diocletian decided to split the empire. Every step in this chain of causation made sense at the time. Diocletian split the empire to make it more manageable. The East kept its wealth to defend itself. The West made deals with barbarians because it didn't have enough soldiers. The barbarians slowly took over because the West was too weak to stop them. Each decision was logical given the circumstances, but the cumulative effect was disaster. This is what makes history so fascinating and so frustrating. You can trace these chains of causation backward, link by link, decision by decision, and see how everything connects. But the people making the decisions at each step couldn't see the big picture. They were responding to immediate problems with practical solutions. They didn't know they were setting in motion a chain of events that would end in the fall of Rome. Diocletian couldn't know that splitting the empire would lead to its fall. If he had known, he probably would have made a different choice. But he didn't know. He couldn't know. Nobody can predict the future with certainty. All you can do is make the best decision you can with the information you have and hope it works out. And that's the tragedy. Diocletian did make the best decision he could. Given the circumstances he faced, splitting the empire was reasonable, maybe even necessary. The empire was in crisis. Something had to change. The status quo wasn't sustainable. So he changed it, and in the short term, it worked. The empire stabilized. The problems were managed. Rome survived. But in the long term, the change he made created new problems that eventually proved fatal. The split that saved Rome in the 3rd century killed it in the 5th century. The solution became the problem. And there's something deeply human about that. We're always solving today's problems in ways that create tomorrow's problems. We're always making decisions that seem smart now, but turn out to be disastrous later. Let me give you some other historical examples of this pattern. In 1919, after World War I, the Allied powers imposed harsh penalties on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted to punish Germany for starting the war and make sure Germany could never threaten Europe again. It made sense. It was understandable. But those harsh penalties created resentment and economic hardship in Germany that contributed to the rise of Hitler and the start of World War II. The solution to one war created the conditions for the next war. Or think about the development of antibiotics. When penicillin was discovered in 1928, it was a miracle. It saved millions of lives. Infections that used to be death sentences became easily treatable. But antibiotics were used so widely, so carelessly, that bacteria evolved resistance. Now we're facing antibiotic-resistant superbugs that could kill millions of people. The solution to one problem created a new, potentially worse problem. Or consider social media. In the early 2000s, platforms like Facebook and Twitter seemed like they would bring people together, democratize information, give everyone a voice. And in some ways, they did. But they also created echo chambers, spread misinformation, amplified extremism, and maybe contributed to increased polarization and mental health problems. The solution to connecting people created new problems about how people connect. This pattern is everywhere in history. We solve problems in ways that create new problems. We make decisions that seem smart now but turn out badly later. We divide things that should stay unified. We unify things that should stay separate. We act with good intentions and produce bad results. We try to save things and end up destroying them. Diocletian split Rome to save it and ended up destroying it. And the worst part is, he never knew. He died in 311, thinking he'd been successful, thinking his reforms had worked, thinking he'd saved the empire. He never saw Rome sacked in 410. He never saw the Western Empire fall in 476. He never knew that his solution, his great achievement, was actually the beginning of the end. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe ignorance is mercy. Because if Diocletian had known, if he had seen the future, if he had understood what his decision would lead to, it would have broken him. This man who spent his entire life serving Rome, who worked his way up from nothing, who held the empire together through sheer force of will and intelligence, who reformed everything trying to save it. To know that he'd actually doomed it would have been unbearable. But we know. We have the benefit of hindsight. We can look back over the centuries and see the whole story from start to finish. We can trace the chain of causation from Diocletian's decision in 285 to the fall of Rome in 476. We can see how it all connects. And we can learn from it. What's the lesson? I think there are several. First, unity matters. When people are unified, when they share a common identity and common purpose, they can overcome enormous challenges. When people are divided, when they see themselves as separate groups with separate interests, they become vulnerable. The Roman Empire survived for centuries because Romans from Britain to Egypt all saw themselves as Romans first. When that unity broke down, the empire fell. Second, short-term solutions can have long-term consequences. Diocletian's split saved the empire in the short term but doomed it in the long term. This happens all the time. We make decisions to solve immediate problems without thinking about what those decisions might lead to down the road. We need to think more carefully about second-order effects, third-order effects, the long chains of causation that flow from our choices. Third, institutions matter. Once you create an institutional division, it becomes real. It shapes how people think and act. Diocletian created 2 separate imperial governments, 2 separate administrations, 2 separate power structures. And once those institutions existed, they developed their own momentum, their own interests, their own identities. Institutions aren't just bureaucratic structures. They're frameworks that shape human behavior and human identity. Fourth, geography and resources matter. The East survived because it was rich and defensible. The West fell because it was poor and vulnerable. This is a hard truth, but it's a truth. Material conditions matter, economics matters, geography matters. You can't overcome bad fundamentals with good leadership or high morale or strong culture forever. Eventually, the side with more resources and better geography wins. Fifth, decline is usually gradual. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't fall in a year. It didn't even fall in a generation. It took almost 200 years from Diocletian's split to the fall of the West. And during those 200 years, there were moments of recovery, moments where it looked like things might turn around. But the overall trend was decline. And that's how most great civilizations fall. Not suddenly, but gradually. Not with a bang, but with a long, slow whimper. And finally, good intentions aren't enough. Diocletian had good intentions. He loved Rome. He wanted to save it. He worked hard, made sacrifices, did everything he could think of to preserve the empire. But his solution, his well-intentioned, logical, practical solution, ended up contributing to Rome's destruction. Good intentions don't guarantee good results. Smart people make mistakes. Reasonable decisions have unreasonable consequences. So what does all this mean for us today? Well, think about the divisions in our own world. Political divisions, economic divisions, cultural divisions, regional divisions. These divisions often start for practical reasons, for good reasons even. But once they're created, they become real. They shape how people think about themselves and others. They create separate identities and separate interests. And when crisis comes, those divisions become dangerous. Look at the United States, for example. It's increasingly divided between red states and blue states, urban and rural. Different ethnic and religious groups. Different economic classes. These divisions have been growing for decades. And while the country is still united, still functions as one nation, there are worrying signs. People increasingly live in separate information ecosystems, consume separate media, believe separate facts. They're Americans, yes. But they also increasingly separate kinds of Americans with different values and different visions for the country's future. Or look at the European Union. It's a union of separate countries trying to work together, share resources, coordinate policies. In good times, it works pretty well. But in bad times, in times of crisis, the divisions show. During the 2008 financial crisis, there were tensions between rich northern countries and poor southern countries. During the migration crisis of 2015, there were fights about who should take responsibility for refugees. During the COVID pandemic, countries competed with each other for vaccines and medical supplies instead of cooperating. The EU hasn't fallen apart yet, maybe it never will. But the tensions are there, the divisions are there. And if a big enough crisis comes, those divisions could become fatal. Just like they did for Rome, or think about the world as a whole. We're facing global challenges that require global cooperation. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence. These are problems that don't respect national borders. They affect everyone. They require everyone to work together to solve. But the world is divided. Countries compete with each other for resources and power. Different regions have different interests and different priorities. Rich countries and poor countries blame each other. Democratic countries and authoritarian countries distrust each other. And these divisions make it harder to cooperate, harder to solve the big problems we face. Maybe we need more unity. Maybe we need to remember that we're all humans first, before we're Americans or Chinese or Europeans or whatever. Maybe we need to prioritize our common humanity over our separate identities. Maybe that's the lesson of Rome. Unity is hard to maintain but essential for survival. Division is easy to create but potentially fatal. Or maybe the lesson is different. Maybe the lesson is that nothing lasts forever. Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire, this great civilization that ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries, eventually came to an end. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just how history works. Civilizations rise, flourish, decline, and fall. New civilizations emerge to replace them. Life goes on. The fall of Rome wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't even the end of Roman culture. As I mentioned earlier, the barbarian kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire tried to preserve Roman culture. The Catholic Church kept Latin alive as a language of learning and religion. The Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years. And eventually, new civilizations emerged in Europe that drew on Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman ideas. The Renaissance was literally a rebirth of classical culture. So maybe empires are supposed to fall. Maybe that's part of the cycle. Maybe trying to hold things together forever is fighting against the natural flow of history. Maybe Diocletian should have just let the empire fall in the 3rd century instead of trying to save it. Maybe the extra 200 years weren't worth it. But I don't think that's right. I think those 200 years mattered. Millions of people lived their lives during those 200 years. They fell in love, raised families, built things, created art, told stories. Their lives mattered. The fact that the empire eventually fell doesn't mean it wasn't worth preserving for a while longer. And besides, the effort matters. The attempt to hold things together, to solve problems, to overcome challenges, that's what makes us human. Diocletian tried to save Rome. He failed in the end, but he tried. And there's something noble about that, something worth remembering. So here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about Rome, still learning from Rome, still trying to understand what happened and why. And the answer, or at least part of the answer, comes down to one decision made by one emperor in the year 285. Diocletian split the Roman Empire. He thought he was saving it. And in a way he did for a while. But he also doomed it. One decision, one choice, one moment where history turned. And the Roman Empire, this great civilization that had survived for over 1,000 years, began its long, slow decline into division, weakness, and eventual collapse. Not because Diocletian was stupid or evil or incompetent, but because he was human, because he made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time but had consequences he couldn't predict, because he tried to solve one problem and accidentally created another, because the future is uncertain and history is complicated and sometimes even the smartest solutions lead to disaster. That's the story. That's how the Roman Empire fell. Not in a single battle. Not in a sudden catastrophe. But slowly, gradually, over nearly 2 centuries, starting with a decision that seemed smart at the time but ultimately proved fatal. One decision that ended the Roman Empire. And if you think about it, isn't that terrifying? One choice, made with good intentions by a capable leader, and an entire civilization falls. Makes you wonder about the choices we're making today, doesn't it? What decisions are we making right now that seem smart but might doom us in the long run? What problems are we solving in ways that will create worse problems later? What divisions are we creating that will weaken us when crisis comes? I don't have the answers. Nobody does. We can't see the future any better than Diocletian could. All we can do is try our best, make the wisest choices we can, and hope things work out. But the fall of Rome reminds us to be humble, to recognize that even our best ideas might be wrong, to think carefully about long-term consequences, to value unity over division, to remember that nothing lasts forever and every decision matters. The Roman Empire fell. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476, brought down by the cumulative weight of nearly 200 years of division that started with Diocletian's decision in 285. It is one of the most important events in human history. It marks the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval period. It changed the course of Western civilization. And it all traces back to one decision made by one man trying to solve one problem. That's history. That's how the world works. One decision at a time. One choice at a time. Building the future whether we realize it or not, for better or worse, whether we want to or not. And centuries later, people will look back and try to understand what we did and why. They'll trace the chains of causation. They'll see connections we couldn't see. They'll judge our choices by their consequences, not our intentions. Just like we judged Diocletian. He tried to save Rome, he failed. And now, 1700 years after his death, we remember him as the emperor whose solution doomed the empire he loved. That's his legacy. Not the reforms he enacted. Not the enemies he defeated. Not the years of stability he created. But the split. The division. The decision that set in motion the fall of Rome. One decision that ended the Roman Empire. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's what history teaches us. Be careful what you do. Think about the consequences. Value unity. Remember that today's solutions can become tomorrow's problems. And know that your choices matter more than you might realize in ways you might never know. Rome fell because Diocletian split it. That's the truth, or at least a big part of the truth. And we're still learning from it, still thinking about it, still trying to understand it. Because Rome's story is humanity's story. The story of civilization rising and falling, of problems and solutions, of good intentions and bad results, of unity and division, of trying and failing and trying again. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we should never try. Not that we should never make changes or take risks or attempt solutions, but that we should be humble. That we should think carefully. That we should value what holds us together more than what tears us apart. That we should learn from history so we don't repeat it. The Roman Empire fell. Let's try not to make the same mistakes. Let's try to do better. Let's try to build things that last, create unity that endures, make decisions that don't doom the civilizations we love. That's what we owe to the past. That's what we owe to the future. That's what we owe to Diocletian and all the Romans who came after him, who watched their world fall apart and couldn't stop it. One decision ended the Roman Empire. Let's make sure our decisions don't end ours. If you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe.